it seems like everyone's going across all the chains, right? And kind of looking for leverage positions, looking for shit that may blow up. And they might have noticed something on Solend Finance, right? In regards to a whale. Can you kind of fill us in what's happening there?
Yeah, this is a particularly hitting close to home issue because I was a depositor on Solend throughout this. Essentially, what happened was a true degen in anyone's eyes took out a big loan on Solend. And essentially what they did was deposit back in February about 500 million worth of Sol tokens and borrowed 100 something million in mostly USDC against that. And as the market went down, they continued to lever up. They continued to borrow more against this. And now they're close to liquidation because now that those Solana tokens are worth something like 180 million and they've got something like 120 million borrowed against it. So they just continue to lever up when everyone else would have been telling them, hey, you need to delever your position as the market goes down, as we were talking about earlier. So this is a true degen as I've ever seen, continuing to lever up, hoping that they don't have this liquidation event. Now, the problem is if they do get liquidated, which last I checked was around $22 per Sol, the way that the Solend liquidation process works is that people have to take those Sol tokens and immediately dump them on chain for USDC to pay off the USDC debt. And of course, they keep some of I think there's a 5% profit they can keep there. The problem is there's not enough liquidity on chain to handle a $180 million dumping of Sol tokens. There's only enough liquidity for 10 to 20 million. And even then, it's going to severely depress the on-chain price of Solana down to the teens. And so there's been a bunch of people putting stink bids out there on the Serum order book, hoping this process happens. I think someone put like $10 million at like $9 a Sol, something like that, hoping that it'll just dump right into them. And so it's been causing a crisis in the Solend community because you can't withdraw your USDC. There's no liquidity available. It's all borrowed, right? There's no USDC actually in the contract for anyone to withdraw. And of course, this jacks the interest rates up because they use dynamic interest rate models. And the higher the utilization, the higher the interest rate, and it capped out around 65%. So, okay, you're getting 65%, but potentially you're going to take a haircut on your deposit if this liquidation happens and it can't raise the funds to pay back all the debt. Furthermore, the whale that borrowed all this money, they're paying 65% to keep this leverage position open. And that eventually is going to cause a liquidation anyway. Even if the price of Solana stays the same, that is going to increase their debt until it hits the liquidation point. So there's this impending crisis for Solend. Basically, the only thing that could save this is if the price of Sol just continues to go up from here. That could sort of save the day. But I don't think in this bear market, anyone's expecting that. It seems that we might as well assume this liquidation is going to happen eventually. And that if it happens with the liquidity, the way that it is on chain right now, there's going to be a bad debt situation for the protocol, and that USDC depositors are going to take a haircut. And this would just be completely devastating for all these retail depositors, of which there's thousands in this pool, all because one irresponsible whale borrowed too much money against it. So this spurred a governance crisis in the Solend community. And what happened was a DAO was spun up within a couple hours after this started to make headlines to do a vote, an emergency vote, to take over the whale's deposits, take over their position so that there could be an over-the-counter sale to a third-party market maker. Because Solana is mostly traded on centralized exchanges right now. There's a few $billion a day of total volume on Solana. And so a third-party market maker is going to be able to dump these Sol tokens into the centralized exchanges and get enough USDC to pay off the debt without causing a major crash in the price of the token. So the idea was take over this whale's account, run a manual liquidation, give the tokens to the market maker, and do this OCC deal to pay off the debt. And the proposal went to the DAO, which again was just basically just spun up and they had 6 hours worth of voting. And what was crazy was it was basically decided by one person. Most people only have the Solend tokens from yield farming. If you've been a depositor or a borrower in Solend, you've got a couple tokens from doing that. But somebody actually went and bought millions of dollars of the Solend tokens, and they've been sort of dollar cost averaging, over time into this. And this single person voted, and they were something like 70% of the money in this vote. And so you have somebody with a few $1 million worth of Solend tokens deciding the fate of nearly $200 million of a whale. Not only that, but it goes against the ethos of decentralization to be able to take over a customer position like this, right? That people are saying, you might as well do a TradFi loan shop if this is what you're going to do. And so it caused a huge backlash in the community. I mean, I've basically seen nothing on Twitter but flack on Solend for the last couple of days. But it was well-deserved because it truly is against the ethos here. So after all the backlash was going through and the devs were, constantly dealing with this, I think they had a change of heart and they put up another vote that nullified the first vote. And it basically said, okay, sorry guys, we're not going to do this. We're going to nullify the first vote and then we're going to figure out what to do next. So that vote went through and it passed, and including the same whale that voted on the first time voted yes on this one as well. So, I guess he learned his lesson. And now there's a third proposal that just passed that is basically going to do piecemeal liquidations of this position if it's not managed. Now, the crazy thing is, throughout this whole process, throughout this whole crisis of this liquidation and the potential bad debt to Solend and the crazy governance process that's gone down, the whale has said absolutely nothing. This person's sitting on $200 million on the verge of liquidation. And mind you, this liquidation could be a complete disaster for them because in a normal market with liquidity, you wouldn't have to sell the whole position to raise the debt. But because there's no liquidity, they could lose everything in this liquidation. This whale has been totally silent up until, I think, yesterday. They finally got in contact with the developers and said, oh, okay, we'll settle this. And the way they settled this in a true degen fashion, they didn't delever. What they did was they moved some of their leverage over to Mango markets. And so they basically withdrew some of the SOL that they had in Solend. They put it in Mango, borrowed USDC against it over there, and then paid off some USDC in Solend so that they could continue to do that cycle a few times and moved a few dozen $1 million worth over to Mango. And that's reduced some of the systemic risk to Solend. And it's allowed USDC depositors who want to withdraw. So I had some USDC in Solend and I was able to withdraw. Actually, I withdrew before this happened because I was just refreshing the page like mad for the last couple of days, waiting for anyone to pay off a loan so I could get out of there. And I actually went to the extent of writing a little bot to ping me whenever a depositor paid it off. I was that wanting to get out. But now I think everyone who wanted to get out can get out, and everyone who wants to collect that 65% APY at risk of taking a haircut can now sit there and do that. And so far, it seems like some of the risk has been mitigated now that this position is smaller and that the liquidation point has gone down a bit, but it's still there. And there's still not enough liquidity on chain to liquidate the full amount. So it's really just been a crazy story of bad governance decisions, a true degen of a whale, and a lot of depositors, including myself, not really anticipating this solvency risk to the protocol. A lot of lessons to be learned here, and it's still evolving.
I mean, from a voting and governance standpoint, right? Like, obviously, we see a lot of people keep trialing different ways to manage this, right? And so, what you've seen happen in this situation, what do you think is a good path moving forward, and how do we kind of validate that? Maybe if it's just one person voting, or it's not one person who has 100 wallets, or whatever it may be, or it's not the whale that gets the most votes.
Yeah, there's a couple ways I think we can address this. The thing we can do right away is to reduce exposure to the governance process in the core smart contracts. So right now, the Solend DAO has full authority to upgrade the code of anything in the Solend system. And so that basically gives the DAO full control. If it wanted to, it could upgrade the code such that it allows them to steal all the money, right? And so you're exposed as a depositor to anything the DAO wants to do. So what we could do is we could deploy new smart contracts that have no code upgrade permissions, that anything that custodies the funds, we're not going to allow any code upgrades there. And that would mitigate the risk of a bad DAO vote to depositors, or mitigate the risk of a governance attack where someone just buys up a bunch of tokens to get a bad vote passed. Now, the downside of that is if there is a bug or vulnerability in the code and the DAO needs to do like an emergency upgrade, which we have seen in a number of protocols, it can't do that. What's going to have to happen is it's going to have to deploy new contracts and then inform depositors, hey, you need to migrate. You need to go on the website, you need to click the migrate button. Otherwise, there's a vulnerability. So there's sort of a trade-off there. It's like the ability to respond to vulnerabilities quickly and automatically, or not exposing your users to governance issues. That's what we can do right now. And I think the plan for Solend is to implement this and to have these core smart contracts not upgradable by the DAO. In the long term, though, I don't think that's the way to go. I think the ability to respond to vulnerabilities quickly is very important to depositors. And going forward, I would like to see some more complicated governance structures in place. So I'm a huge fan of what's known as quadratic voting. And this is where the voting power of your account is the square root of your tokens rather than the absolute amount of tokens. So a big whale with 1 million tokens is not going to have 1 million times as much voting power as somebody with 1 token. They're going to have the square root of 1 million tokens. And then somebody with 1, square root of 1 is still 1. So it really evens out whales controlling the governance. And it requires a more common consensus between governance token holders and eliminates some of the risk of a governance attack where someone just comes in and buys a bunch of tokens to try to pass something through. I really think that's the way to go in the long term with governance. However, that requires a self-sovereign identity system, because a whale could just split up their account between multiple accounts. And then the square root of that wouldn't be as bad. They would look like a bunch of small users. So we really need a way to associate an identity with an account so that someone can't have duplicate accounts. And those systems like Proof of Humanity or Bright ID, they're not really ready for prime time yet. It could be a couple years before those are really ready to serve the other dApps. The other thing I would like to see is an arbitration system like Cronos be able to overrule code upgrades or other proposals to DAOs, so that if, for example, a DAO has a constitution that says we're never going to take over a depositor's account, a DAO could propose something, it could propose a way to do that, but then someone could dispute that proposal in the court, send that over to the court system, and then the court would rule on, does this code upgrade actually violate the Constitution? And in the case of the Constitution saying, no, we're not going to take over accounts, it would block that proposal. And so this sort of gives some checks and balances to DAOs. If they're going to have this code upgrade permission, we need some checks there, and having a constitution that they have to abide by, I think, is a good way to do that. And we could do this today. Claros works today. It is in its early days, but I would really like to see a DAO try this out and have a constitution that they can arbitrate proposals with. And so I think if you combine the quadratic voting with a court system to arbitrate proposals, I think you have a very solid governance system. And I'm really excited to see this play out. And I think that this is going to be what actually makes DAOs competitive against traditional corporations, where it's kind of the Wild West right now and sort of anything goes, and it's controlled by whales and so forth. But once we have these more sophisticated layers of governance, it's really going to take DAOs to the next level.
Good.